What kind of man marries a 12-year-old girl, only to never touch her, never speak much, and leave her everything when he dies? To the villagers, it looked like exploitation. To her family, it was desperation. But to Marisol, it was the beginning of a truth no one was ready to believe. This isn't a story about romance, it's about protection. It's about a quiet war one man fought against a global crime few dared to confront. And a girl who would one day finish what he started. At just 12 years old, Marisol Rivera sat across from a man nearly 6 times her age. His name was Arthur Langston, a retired engineer from Michigan who now lived in a modest home on the edge of her remote village. Her hands trembled as she pressed her fingerprint onto the marriage document, an act that would forever change how the world would see her. The villagers whispered. Some said she was lucky. Others said she was sold. But Marisol knew the truth was simpler and more brutal. Her little brother Gabriel was dying, and no one else had stepped forward. Her family had knocked on every door they could find. When the clinic stopped answering, when the church ran out of funds, when even the local officials said, "We've done what we can," that's when Arthur appeared. He didn't smile much. He didn't bargain. He simply offered one thing: enough money to save Gabriel's life and enough to feed the rest of the family through the year. In return, he asked for a marriage. The papers were signed in silence. Arthur brought no ring, no celebration, and no wedding night. He simply handed over the check, helped Gabriel into a proper hospital, and drove Marisol back to his home in a vehicle that looked like it had once belonged to a diplomat. Many assumed the worst. But the worst never came. He gave her a room of her own. Never entered it. Never raised his voice. Meals appeared on time. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Marisol would often sit by the window and watch the goats in the neighboring field. The man who was now legally her husband would spend hours in his study, alone, surrounded by dusty files and soft jazz playing low. At night she would lie awake, listening, waiting, wondering, why wasn't he doing what men like him were expected to do? The villagers kept their distance. Whispers turned into rumors, and rumors into judgment. But behind closed doors, there was only stillness. Arthur never touched her, he barely spoke. And when he did, it was only to ask if she needed more books, more fruit, more space. He never looked at her the way the others did. It wasn't love, not even kindness, really. It felt like obligation. But to what? To whom? Marisol didn't know it yet, but this wasn't a marriage. It was a shield. And the man the village called strange was the only one who saw what was really coming. She wasn't saved from the world. She was saved from something much worse. By the 3rd week, Marisol began to fear something she couldn't name. Not Arthur, not the house, but the silence between them. She had expected discomfort, even cruelty. She had braced herself for the dark things whispered by older girls who came back changed, quieter from arrangements like hers. But none of it happened. Arthur never entered her room. He didn't lock it, didn't guard it, didn't check on her at night. He placed a small lamp on her desk, some folded pajamas, and a neatly wrapped set of notebooks. On the wall, someone had hung a calendar in Spanish, dates marked with local holidays she hadn't celebrated in years. He spoke softly, always addressed her as Miss Rivera. If she dropped a fork, he'd bend to pick it up. If she cried at dinner, he'd say nothing, only push the tissues a little closer. If she asked for something, he made sure it was there the next day. Still, the questions clawed at her. What did he want? Why had he done this? She began watching him. Arthur woke at 5:30 every morning, made 1 cup of black coffee, read from the same battered notebook. Then he would leave, sometimes for a few hours, sometimes for days, and always return with nothing more than a backpack and a faint smell of travel dust. He never explained where he'd gone. One afternoon, Marisol lingered near his study. Through the cracked door, she saw walls covered with pinned documents, maps, and photographs of unfamiliar faces. Letters written in different languages, handwritten notes, receipts, news clippings. When the floor creaked under her foot, he looked up. His eyes were tired, but he didn't raise his voice. "I'll lock it next time," he said. Not angry, just resigned. And he did. But something shifted that day. At dinner, Arthur asked her if she missed school, if she liked math, if she still drew pictures like the one she'd left under her plate that morning. When she nodded, surprised, he said, "You're allowed to be a child here." The words struck her harder than she expected, because she didn't remember the last time she had been one. To the villagers, Arthur remained a mystery. To Marisol, he was a contradiction. A man with no warmth, but no threat either. She couldn't tell if he was lonely or simply unreachable. But one thing became clear. Arthur Langston wasn't trying to own her. He was trying to give her something he had lost. And slowly, without realizing it, she began to feel safe. Not loved, not free, but safe for the first time in her life. Marisol had never been one to snoop. But something about that room lingered in her thoughts. Its locked door, the sudden shift in Arthur's tone, the quiet weight of whatever it held. It wasn't curiosity that pushed her to find the key. It was fear. Fear that maybe she'd been wrong to feel safe. It took 2 weeks before she found it, tucked inside an old globe in the hallway. The key was small and unmarked, like it had been waiting for her. The door creaked open at dusk. What she expected was darkness. What she found was a gallery. There were photographs everywhere, hundreds of them, arranged with care. Girls from all corners of the world, some smiling, some solemn, some barely older than she was. Each photo was paired with a name, a country, and a date. Beneath every set, a folder. Inside, letters. Marisol's breath caught. The walls weren't painted with secrets. They were stitched with lives. Girls who had once been vulnerable, now traced through papers and ink like Arthur had been trying to hold on to their stories. She pulled one folder at random. The girl's name was Layla. From Lebanon, age 11. The letter inside was a thank you note, written in shaky French with a drawing of a sunflower. Another folder. Kemi, Nigeria. A school scholarship signed with Arthur's name. Another. Anna, Honduras. A medical file with dates that matched a deadly flood that had ravaged her town. And then, one with her name. Marisol Rivera. Letter dated 1 month before she arrived. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. Miss Rivera, it began in Arthur's slanted script. If you are reading this, it means you found the room I meant to show you myself. I want you to know that none of this was by accident. Not your arrival, not our silence, not this house. There are things I cannot tell you yet, but when the time comes you will understand why I did what I did. She read the letter 3 times. It didn't answer her questions. It raised more. But it did something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. It told her she mattered. Not as a body, not as a burden, but as a person whose name was worth writing down, whose story was worth protecting. That night, Marisol didn't sleep. She stayed in the room, reading letter after letter, watching as the lives of strangers slowly pieced together a truth far bigger than her own. Arthur Langston hadn't bought her. He had chosen her. And not because he wanted anything in return. Because someone else had. It was a week later, early morning, before the sun had fully broken over the hills, when Arthur finally spoke the words Marisol didn't know she'd been waiting to hear. He didn't sit her down. He didn't dramatize it. He simply set a faded envelope on the table, tapped it once, and said, "That's the man who was supposed to buy you." Marisol stared at the photo. The man in it wore a suit and a diplomatic smile. Nothing about him seemed dangerous. But Arthur's voice didn't waver. His name is Dario Mendez. He runs an orphan aid network based out of Mexico City. On paper, it's a charity. In reality, it's a market. I've been tracking him for over a decade. Marisol didn't speak. Arthur continued. You are already on a list. Your name, your age, your price. A man like him doesn't wait. He buys. He disappears. And girls like you don't come back. The room felt colder than it should have. Arthur didn't apologize. He didn't offer comfort. He just told the truth, piece by piece, as if laying bricks on a foundation he knew she needed to stand on. I offered your family something different, not because I wanted a wife. I haven't been a husband in 30 years, but because I knew they were running out of options, and Dario doesn't ask for permission. He takes. Marisol remembered the way her mother had avoided eye contact when handing her the dress for the ceremony. The way her father had fumbled with the pen when signing the marriage form. She had thought it was shame. Now she understood. It was fear. The silence hadn't been neglect. It had been surrender. She stood up from the table, walked to the window, and for the first time since arriving she asked him directly, "How many others?" Arthur didn't hesitate. 94. Girls like you, some I got to early, some I didn't. That's why I locked the room. Why me? He looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her. Because you were next. Marisol didn't cry, she didn't thank him. She just stood there, letting the weight of it all settle into her bones. This wasn't a rescue, it was a rescue mission, and the man the world had called strange had been fighting a war no one else saw. Marisol thought Arthur had saved her once. She was wrong. He had spent the better part of 2 decades saving girls just like her, over and over, until there was barely anything left of himself to give. His study wasn't just a private room, it was a war map. Every folder, every letter, every marked location, pieces of a campaign he had waged quietly, outside the law, without recognition or applause. Arthur never said he was a hero. He said he was tired. Marisol began noticing things she hadn't before. The way his hands shook when he signed checks. The stack of uncashed dividends piling up in the drawer. The old car he refused to replace. He had money once, enough to live twice over. But it was almost gone now, filtered through anonymous donations, school funds, visa applications, and escape routes for children who would never know his name. In his own country, he had once been a systems engineer for a defense contractor. Precise, private, predictable. But something had snapped after his daughter's death. Her name was Lily. She was 10 when a trafficking ring in Manila got to her during a family trip. By the time they found her, it was too late. Arthur never forgave himself, so he did the only thing he could. He made sure no other Lily would be taken. Marisol found Lily's photo in the top drawer of his desk. No words, just a date and a blue ribbon taped to the back. When she asked him about it, he didn't speak. Just closed the drawer, gently, like someone tucking in a memory. What stunned her most wasn't the scope of what he'd done. It was how methodically he had erased himself from it. No credit, no signatures, no foundation named after him. Just quiet acts of protection, stacked like bricks against a storm. "You're not the first person I've given everything to," he told her one evening as they watched the news. "You might be the last." And in that moment, Marisol saw Arthur not as a savior or a husband, but as a man who had built a life from ruin. Not for himself, but for others. He had poured his fortune into a battle no one knew he was fighting, and he never once asked to be thanked. Arthur died on a Tuesday. It was quiet, no ambulance, no final words, just a stillness in the house that felt different. Permanent. Marisol found him in his reading chair, a book resting on his chest, his glasses still on. Outside, the goats wandered the fence line, unaware that the man who once mended their shelter was gone. She didn't cry. Not at first. She made tea, sat beside him for hours. Only when the sun dipped low did she call the doctor. And then the silence shattered. The village didn't mourn Arthur Langston. They didn't know how. To them, he was still the strange American who had married a child, locked his doors, and kept to himself. They whispered, speculated, watched as the notary arrived with sealed documents and a suitcase full of legal files. The will was read 3 days later. Everything, his house, his accounts, his assets, was left to Marisol Rivera. Not to a foundation, not to distant relatives. To her, a girl they thought was nothing more than a paid companion. A transaction. Some gasped, others grew angry. Manipulation, they muttered. Scandal. But the lawyer had expected this. He opened a second envelope, Arthur's instructions. Detailed, dated, signed, and notarized across multiple jurisdictions. Arthur had covered every legal angle. The villagers weren't angry because they had been wrong about the man. They were angry because they had been certain they were right. Only one person stood up at the reading. Tomas Alvarez, the village's retired police chief, now 71, cane in hand. He cleared his throat and said, "Langston saved my niece when no one else could. She never came back, but at least we know she's alive. Let the girl have what's hers." After that, no one spoke. Marisol didn't attend the burial. Instead, she walked through every room of the house, quietly, reverently, touching each object he had once touched. She found no hidden vaults, no more secrets, just the ordinary belongings of a man who had spent his final years giving everything away. That night, she opened the drawer with Lily's photo. She placed it on the mantel, and beside it, her own. No flowers, no prayers, just 2 pictures side by side. Proof that even after death, Arthur Langston kept his promise. He didn't just protect her, he left her the tools to build a future no one could take away. The inheritance didn't change Marisol. It revealed her. She didn't leave the village. She didn't sell the house or vanish into wealth. Instead, she walked back into the community that once whispered behind her back and asked one question. What do you need? The clinic was first. It had shut down the year Gabriel fell ill. Under her name, it reopened within 2 months, with running water, real beds, and nurses trained through a fund she named the Lily Initiative. Then came the school. Not just a single building, but a curriculum. One that taught girls how to speak, how to write, how to question. Boys, too. Everyone learned what marriage should mean and what it should never be. But the heart of it all was the law. In her region, child marriage was still tolerated under the veil of tradition. No one enforced age minimums. No one punished families or middlemen. It was a system built on silence. Marisol didn't scream. She documented. She worked with a lawyer from the capital, Daniel Espinoza, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who had once resigned from the government in protest. Together, they drafted a proposal that would make underage marriage not just illegal, but indefensible. No loopholes, no exceptions. She testified before regional leaders, armed not with tears, but with data. How many girls had disappeared? How many had died in childbirth? How many had been lost in names like hers, printed on lists like the one Arthur had shown her? And when the law passed, it wasn't just a political win, it was a funeral. But the silence. Even the villagers who had once doubted her began to soften. Some apologized, others volunteered. Tomas, the former police chief, donated land for the new learning center. His own granddaughter enrolled in the very first class. Marisol didn't claim victory. She got back to work. Every child she met, every girl who looked at her with that same mix of fear and wonder, she saw herself. Not who she had been forced to become, but who she was always meant to be. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't a symbol. She was a builder. And now, with Arthur's trust and her own will, she was rebuilding a world where girls like her would never have to be saved again. She found it weeks later, tucked into the spine of a leather-bound atlas Arthur kept on the highest shelf of his study. At first, it looked like a simple ledger. Dates, initials, locations. But as Marisol turned the pages, the pattern revealed itself. This wasn't a journal. It was a list. A long, methodical, terrifying list. Names of traffickers, smugglers, corrupt border agents, complicit officials, evidence attached to each, receipts, photographs, email logs, even court transcripts that had quietly disappeared from public record. Arthur had spent his final years not just saving girls, he had been gathering proof. On the last page in his handwriting was a sentence underlined 3 times. Use your voice. Burn the dark. Marisol stared at it for hours. Then she picked up the phone. What followed was not dramatic. No press conferences. No viral videos. Just a quiet email to Daniel Espinoza and then a meeting with an NGO in the capital. The data was encrypted, secured, and distributed to journalists and legal organizations across 4 countries. But it didn't stop there. Using Arthur's list as the foundation, Marisol founded the Langston Report, a global coalition that worked with investigative reporters, human rights lawyers, and grassroots activists to track child marriage and human trafficking networks. She became a name people whispered in government halls. By age 14, she addressed the United Nations. She didn't cry. She didn't perform. She told them the story of a man who had once bought her freedom, only to hand her the pen to write her own laws. By 15, her efforts had helped pass legislation in 3 countries. Her face never appeared on magazine covers. She refused awards, declined television interviews, and told every organization the same thing. If you want to honor me, protect someone. Don't just talk about me. But people did talk. They talked about a girl from nowhere who turned a funeral into a movement. They talked about Arthur Langston, once misunderstood, now revered as a man who fought a war with nothing but his pension and his conscience. And they talked about a list that had once sat in silence, until the right hands lit a match beneath it. Years had passed. Marisol still lived in Arthur's house, though it had changed. The study was now a research room, the spare bedrooms a rotating shelter for girls in transition. The old goat pen had become a courtyard garden, where children played under the shade of trees planted by women who once believed they were invisible. But some things remained untouched. Every Thursday, just after sunrise, Marisol would enter the library alone. No phone, no visitors, just her, the shelves, and the silence. She would sit in the same chair where Arthur used to read. and she would listen. One morning, as wind slipped through the window screens, she opened the drawer where Lily's photo once lay. Now, there were 3 pictures. Lily herself at 12 and a girl named Noor, just rescued last winter from a fake adoption agency operating out of Istanbul. Next to them was a letter, Arthur's last. It wasn't long. No instructions, no legacy speech, just a sentence. I always saw you, even before you saw yourself. Marisol didn't weep. She folded the letter, stood up, and walked to the window. Outside, the village was waking. A group of boys carried new desks into the schoolhouse. A nurse waved from the clinic gate. An old man paused to tip his hat, as if he finally understood something he couldn't say aloud. She placed the letter on the shelf. No frame, no fanfare, because the fight wasn't over. But something had changed. Marisol was no longer the girl everyone talked about. She was the woman they listened to. And she carried with her not just the will of a man who saw what others missed, but the weight of a question every girl should be able to answer with pride. Who protected you? For Marisol, the answer would never be just one name. It would be a quiet house, a locked room, a list, a wind, and a man who said nothing until she was strong enough to speak for them both. In a world that often mistakes silence for weakness and kindness for naivety, Marisol's story reminds us of something vital. Real strength doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it sits quietly in a chair beside someone who's hurting. It shows up with no expectation of praise. It gives, not to be remembered, but because someone must. Arthur Langston didn't wear a badge, hold office, or command attention. But through simple, deliberate acts, he rewrote the fate of nearly 100 lives. That's the lesson we carry into our own lives. The impact we have isn't measured by the noise we make, but by the lives we touch when no one's watching. For many in their 50s, 60s, or 70s, who've spent a lifetime doing the right thing without applause, this story is a quiet validation. You don't need to be famous to be remembered. You don't need wealth to leave something behind. You need conviction, compassion, and the courage to act when it matters, because someone, somewhere, will carry your kindness forward, and they'll remember you not with a monument, but with a life they never thought possible. That's how change happens, one quiet act at a time. Type 1 if you've ever felt powerless in the face of someone else's control. Type 2 if you believe quiet kindness can still change the world. If this story stayed with you, even just for a moment, subscribe. Not because you're expected to, but because stories like Marisol's are still unfolding, quietly, all around us. And the more of us who pay attention, the harder they are to silence. We'll be here, week after week, telling the ones that matter. See you in the next story.